Hi everyone, welcome. I finally got around to using Alice Cooper. I first was like, I have to intro every single lecture with that song, but I found other ones. So, welcome to week 5. It is our last week of federal and state policy. After this week, we will take our midterm exam. How exciting! And then we will get into the nitty gritty of on the ground school administration, which will be a cool shift for us as well. You'll also see this week how we have a lot of kind of connective tissue between those two things. Between this week discussing teachers, unions, and test prep companies, to next week when we start talking about school districts specifically. So, along with our Alice Cooper song, we also saw here a new law that was just passed by the Colorado State Legislature that was protecting educators from doxing. Doxing, if you don't know, is the revealing of personal identifiable information, particularly addresses and contact information, of people who may not have consented to having that information shared out. It's generally associated with acts of violence or threats against people who should not have had their personal identified information, contact information shared with others. Earlier this year, Douglas County teachers staged a walkout in protest of their superintendent being abruptly fired, but there was a lot of parental outrage and the revealing of individual teacher addresses and phone numbers to less than benevolent actors, we'll call it. And so this law is, as the legislators talked about, not something that necessarily should have been something we talked about, but definitely something that is important in today's educational environment. So today we are going to get well into the weeds with a couple of specific actors and systems within our state education policy structure that should be super informative to our final understanding of how the federal and state how federal state institutions influence policymaking overall. All right. So this week we are going to talk about essentially 3 different things. We're going to talk about teachers unions to start. We're going to talk about test prep companies, and then we're going to talk about accountability mechanisms that tie directly into our case study on Adams 14 School District. This week's reading list is a heavier reading list than is typical, but the research on all of these topics is actually pretty fresh. It's a fertile ground for research, and so you'll see as you go through these different readings that it's all kind of talking to each other, and it's all speaking to these major themes that I think are important for us to understand and talk about as we go forward here. And then finally, our assignment for this week, we're finally reading Abrams, and I'm going to have you guys reflect on his prologue through chapter 8, which is basically his discussion of domestic commercialization of education. So it's really cool. I think if you've already dipped into Abrams and started reading it, you'll kind of see how I've structured my lectures and my topics around the direction that he's going as well. I think he made some pretty pertinent arguments. So let's get started this week. So we've talked about state boards of education, we've talked about the legislature, the governor, and kind of the roles that they play, but there are other actors in the state policymaking system that are really important for us to understand. Particularly because last week we talked about actors and institutions with that primary policymaking function of drafting and passing laws, implementation and rulemaking, and regulatory actions that have being taken. But there's a whole world of what I would call secondary policymaking that occurs adjacent to that primary policymaking, where it's the influence over policy agendas and opening of policy windows. Remember those policy windows when we talk about Kinden. The policy windows is the opportunity that's presented when that politics problem and policy streams are sufficiently in alignment. That's when we have the opportunity to actually make a change and make a policy. test and implementation is super important. That is a lot of what especially academic public policy research is spent on. But there's a lot of importance over the influence and who's drafting and who's controlling the implementation of those laws as well. And so while there's so many more actors we can be talking about, I'm gonna pull out two in particular that have a what I would call an inordinate amount of influence over the state policymaking system, and that's teachers unions and test prep companies. So we'll start with teachers unions and collective bargaining in education. So outside of police federations and probably the MLB Players Union, teachers unions are the most powerful collective bargaining entity in all of policymaking. Teachers unions have a massive role in every step of the education policymaking process, particularly at the state level. In almost every state, teachers have the right or the obligation to join a teachers union, which falls either under one of the two larger umbrella organizations, the National Education Association, the NEA, which we have talked about with the Committee of 10 and Cardinal Principles reports, and the American Federation of Teachers, the AFT. A little bit of a history on collective bargaining in education. Super quick overview. This could be not just an entire lecture, but probably an entire class. But first major teachers union was in Chicago. They formed the Chicago Teachers Federations to force the city and the school board to actually compensate teachers. At that point, teachers weren't even paid a salary in Chicago. They were paid room and board. They were given a room and said, go educate our kids, and that's all that they got. And so they formed this union, and in 1902, they organized the first teachers' strike in the country. And it ended up with the suspension of school. And it was all related to this teacher who was removed from her position because she was refused to let a disruptive student back into her classroom after kicking them out. These protests, these walkouts, and these strikes continued. They spread from city to city. And then in 1959, Wisconsin became the first state to formally allow collective bargaining for public employees, including teachers. This opened the floodgates for many other states to take action as well. In 1962, the New York teachers' strike forced the closure of 25 different New York City schools, and what at the time the New York Times labeled as the biggest strike of public servants in American history. That was soon to be eclipsed by the 1968 Florida teachers strike, where 40% of all teachers in the entire state of Florida staged a walkout, which was the largest strike of public servants in American history. These were relatively short-lived strikes, but they had a massive influence. From the 1970s on, like I said, those floodgates were open. The strikes broke out across the country, and they broke out even though in many states collective bargaining at that point was still illegal for these teachers, but they took it upon themselves to do that anyway. And today, because of all the action, because of all the civil unrest that the teachers unions have caused, every state has some sort of affiliate with either the AFT or the NET, but statewide policies change the influence that those unions have over policy making. So if you're not familiar with collective bargaining, here's in general how it works as it applies to teachers in particular. So in the public sector, many employees have the ability to join a union. States may have something on the books that restricts the ability of specific types of public employees to collectively bargain and unionize. However, teachers nationwide have the ability to unionize with various levels of authority. When unionization is allowed, teachers have the option to join local, state, and national unions to provide additional resources and legal protections. So in Colorado, teachers can join their local educator association, the Colorado Education Association, or the National Education Association. Generally, the correlation there is that the closer they are to your specific school district, the more power that they're going to have over your specific condition, but also the more expensive the dues are going to be. So the NEA is the cheapest, but it also provides the least amount of direct benefit to any individual teacher. It's important to know that teachers are not required to join unions or participate in the collective bargaining process. But the goal of unions, especially teachers' unions, is that if enough of the teachers are unionized, they have the ability to undertake collective bargaining for the terms of their employment. This allows them to set salaries, benefits, and resources. This was the reason why I say not required is that this was something that was actually disputed way back in the 70s and was recently changed by the Supreme Court, saying that you can't be compelled to pay dues for a union you're not a part of. There were certain unions across the country that were forcing teachers to pay dues because they were receiving benefits even though they didn't technically join the union. The Supreme Court indicated that that was unconstitutional and is no longer the case. So when unionized and where it is legal, teachers' unions undertake the creation of what's called a collective bargaining agreement. So essentially what this means is that the teachers' union and their representatives will sit down with representatives from the school district and hash out a contract together. This CBA outlines the terms of employment for all unionized employees, which includes the salary and pay scales, benefits, and other policies for which teachers are directly involved. I know a lot of CBAs lately have included safety measures, protections against gun violence, and that sort of thing are included in CBAs as well. CBAs only control the contracts of dues-paying members of the union. Non-member teachers have the ability, technically, to negotiate their own employment contracts, though practically, that's not necessarily the case. Typically what happens, especially if the local union is powerful enough, non-member teachers will receive similar, if not identical, contracts to member teachers, and there's little room for negotiation for the hiring of non-union teachers. In general, if you are curious, I definitely will reveal and disclose a bias of mine. My family has a long history with unions. I am generally pro-union for this exact reason, that they increase salaries, benefits, and improve contract terms. It allows the employees to have a bit of control over their organization, a bit of a higher level of control than they would typically experience. And with teachers' unions in particular, with how fresh of a debate teacher pay has been lately, I think it's really important that we understand the role of CBAs and the role of teachers unions in that discussion. So it's not just the creation of CBAs, though, that teachers unions have the significant soft power to influence the policymaking process overall. Like I said, that secondary policymaking. They're one of the largest spenders on lobbying and education policy in the country. Teachers unions with significant enough influence, if they're large enough, can also sit on commissions created by the State Board of Education or the legislature. They will have a seat at the table when discussing these larger issues. Teachers unions often employ their own policy experts that work directly with lawmakers and regulators to draft and discuss legislation amenable to the union's interests. So the doxing bill, for example, was something that the CEA was directly involved in the drafting and passage of that bill because it was about the protection of teachers, right? More established teachers unions are often seen as subject matter experts within their policymaking communities, and they'll go and testify on potential legislation, and they often have significant influence over how what they're saying. They speak on behalf of the interest of teachers across the state and in their local area. There's a lot of power to that collective voice that is being heard by these unions. In today's policymaking environment, there's teachers unions, their issues have not changed a whole lot from what the Chicago teachers were striking about right around the turn of the 20th century. There's just more of a focus on the specific details. So they still care about salaries and compensation, especially to keep up with the cost of living and inflation in places like Colorado in particular. But the NEA and AFT's joint agenda also outlined a bunch of other broader issues that they see as the priorities for policymaking going forward, such as finding alternatives to high-stakes standardized testing. We kind of talked a little bit about that before. Is it that shadow testing that we see? Is it a more qualitative assessment of a teacher's performance? They also want broadening support for student mental health. So the 2021 was obviously drafted with these coronavirus in mind, and there's growing concern, excuse my dog, there's growing concern about the role that teachers have to play in students' mental health. And, teachers are not trained counselors, they're not trained mental health professionals, but they often have to play that role because there's not enough resources for students. There's also just more interest in minimizing student achievement gaps, particularly for low-income and multilingual students. And these teachers' unions are calling for more directed professional development time for finding ways to better support those specific students. More statewide support for early childhood education. So Colorado is now implementing its statewide universal pre-K system. The teachers' unions are generally amenable to that idea to help give students a leg up in meeting grade level proficiencies. And then the ongoing improvement and support for modernizing the teacher evaluation systems, with less focus on test outcomes in particular. They just want more support for teacher development. They want the teacher evaluation systems to be something that is actually useful for teachers. So now you have to ask the question, right? So this is all the things that teachers unions do and they're interested in, but are they any goods? Well, I think that there's two sides of this coin. So, like I said before, it provides public servants with a moneyed entity that to represent their interests during policymaking process. This is really important, particularly because it is often an ethical gray area about whether or not public servants in particular can have a specific influence in the policymaking process, but these collectively joined interests, like these unions, can speak on their behalf and kind of overcome any sort of ethical gray area. It also improves teacher compensation, particularly at the school district level, and it provides teachers with legal protections against lawsuits, which, as we're finding out, is super important, particularly when it's coming to things like these book bans and the Don't Say Gay bills. That's something that's going to become really important for teachers down the line. And then it also increases the influence of employees in larger organizations and systems. We want to make sure that employees' voice is being heard during the management process, and I think that's a good thing that teachers' unions do. They're not all good, however, and I think the moneyed interest can be seen as a corrupting force for the real interests of teachers to be heard. That's definitely a political argument that's been made. And then CBAs are often negotiated separate from the school budget, meaning that increasing compensation actually may not be accompanied with an increased revenue. So teachers are getting paid more, their pay is going up. Really cool, but if there's not a correlated increase in revenue, that money has to come from somewhere, and it's generally going to detract from some other component of the school budget. This is a lot of our readings on teachers unions in particular is discussing this latter point, right? Where we're discussing how teachers unions actually affect the outcomes of students, right? The researchers have for a long time connected the efficacy of teachers' unions and collective bargaining agreements directly to student achievement outcomes. And what research generally finds is that there is a negative correlation between unionization and collective bargaining agreements and student achievement outcomes, meaning that the more power, the more teachers that are part of the union and part of the collective bargaining agreement, the worse the student outcomes generally are. There's a ton of discourse on this, but the problem is, and this is where I want you to put on your critical thinking, maybe your research development hats, in thinking how this question in particular obfuscates the core issues that unions address, right? In particular, we're directly correlating, we're saying that unionization is directly responsible for student achievement. What assumptions are being made there? Well, I think there's a couple of core assumptions that I could at least think of, but there's definitely more that I bet you guys will be able to bring up. But we're talking about things like there's an assumption that teachers are going to be paid more, therefore they're going to be more effective at their jobs. And I don't think that that's anything that's going to be supported by the research. I think job satisfaction is definitely correlated with that increase in teacher compensation, but I don't think it's necessarily fair to say that increasing pay is going to make them more effective. And I think, moreover, we're also making an assumption that the only thing that's possibly influencing the student performance is the teacher themselves, and there's not anything else, especially at the systemic level, that would influence those student outcomes. I mean, that's basically half of this course, right? Talking about what policies, what decisions are being made that's actually affecting student achievement. When you read the rest of the union research, if you haven't already, keep those assumptions in mind. And I think some of the research that's assigned this week does a better job than others in addressing those assumptions. And I think that definitely affects their ability to make their core argument. But it's a more of an academic sort of exercise, but I think it's really important as policy experts for us to understand the strategies of something like that. Moving on. I revealed my bias in one direction for teachers' unions. And I hope by revealing that bias, you can it will help you understand the way that I chose to teach it. Well, I'm going to reveal another bias here, and test prep companies are evil. And I think the question I'm going to present to you: are they evil, or are they really evil? Sure, I'm shading this one direction, but I have plenty of evidence to suggest that this is the proper question to be asked. So, ton of time we've spent on standardized testing, but the reason why we spend so much time on standardized testing, particularly when we're talking about federal and state policy, is because that's what federal and state policy does, and it's what it has done since A Nation at Risk in 1983. The ability for us to understand how well our students are performing, especially as compared to the rest of the world, is the vested interest of federal policymakers. And so when we saw this slow creep with Reagan, with H.W. Bush, and with Clinton towards more standardized testing and more nationalization of the measurement of student achievement, No Child Left Behind blew it up. It tripled the number of standardized tests required of students in their K-12 education. And it also forced states to utilize those tests in nearly every component of their student accountability or their school accountability systems. But if you're at all familiar or have been in the classroom with standardized testing, with No Child Left Behind, you're probably thinking that there's one big thing that I have left out so far, and that's Common Core. Common Core state standards are a fascinating sub-field of our discussion around standardized testing and No Child Left Behind. What the Common Core standards did was it was an attempt by not federal policymakers and not necessarily even state policymakers, but state members of the state education governance system attempting to align learning objectives across states. So one thing that was immediately evident when No Child Left Behind was not just passed but was starting to be put into practice was that there was massive disparities over how each state was measuring their success criteria. What did it mean for a student to be proficient in reading at a certain level in Alabama versus what it meant for them to be proficient in New York? So the Common Core standards were created. They were created by a couple of different groups that are just more alphabet soup that you definitely don't have to memorize, but the Council of Chief State School Officers and the National Governors Associations. They wanted to create a set of standards that are research and evidence-based, clear, understandable, and consistent, aligned with college and career expectations, based on rigorous content and the application of knowledge through higher-order thinking skills, built upon the strengths and lessons of current state standards, and informed by the top-performing countries in order to prepare all students for success in our global economy and society. If you have any sort of experience from the perspective of a teacher, either yourself or someone you know, a lot of these buzzwords are going to start sounding super familiar, particularly things like that higher order thinking and preparing students for success in the global economy, right? This is all something that has definitely had an influence. So what Common Core did then was it was trying to nationalize education standards. So it took this law, it took this opportunity where everyone was going to have to start doing the same thing to assess student achievement. So why don't we also take that opportunity to make sure that we're all playing with the same rules? We all know what the same barometer for success is. So essentially, what Common Core proposed was not necessarily a law, but it was a recommendation that states adopt this set of standards to set their own curricular standards and measure student and school achievement. Um, what that did is it attempted to align every state's standards for curriculum without formally forcing states to do that. Remember, the federal government probably wouldn't get away with a formal nationalization of state standards. But if every state just agreed to do it, we would achieve that same effect without running into those constitutional issues. Common Core is not without its controversy, though, as teachers who have tried to teach in the Common Core system have experienced as well. There's people who have argued that Common Core has actually made student achievement lower in some areas. People who developed Common Core definitely refute that argument, but there is an argument to suggest that it does prevent some states from setting higher standards than others in an attempt to nationalize those standards. I would also make the argument that the adoption of Common Core has coincided with a bunch of other unpopular policies. The public sentiment change against No Child Left Behind, restrictions on teacher control over course content have come alongside Common Core and not necessarily have been caused by Common Core. I think that there's definitely been a connection, at least in a temporal manner, over when Common Core is adopted and when these other regulatory changes started to go into effect, but I wouldn't say that those were necessarily cause and effect of Common Core, though it is hard to disentangle the effects of Common Core and the effects of No Child Left Behind, because by the time No Child Left Behind was fully implemented, states had already started taking up Common Core as their standard. So, in 2010, Kentucky was the first one to say, hey, we're going to jump on the Common Core bandwagon. And after that, 46 total states chose to adopt or partially adopt the Common Core state standards. That was a massive win for Common Core. It was something that members of both parties at the federal level were arguing and promoting. President Obama was a huge proponent of Common Core standards. Virginia, Texas, Nebraska, and Alaska never adopted the standards, but since this initial phase of adoption, there have been other states that have either fully repealed Common Core standards, Arizona, Oklahoma, Florida, Indiana, and South Carolina, and other states like Colorado who have begun the process to fully or partially repeal Common Core and replace it with their new state-controlled standards. One of the problems we have with measuring the effectiveness of Common Core is that even though these states may be repealing Common Core or did not adopt Common Core entirely, does not mean that they weren't aligning themselves with Common Core. They just weren't following the exact structure that Common Core had laid out. So instead of formally adopting it, they're saying, we like where you're going with it, we just don't want to be bound by this national standard that we don't have any control over. So at times, states like Virginia and Texas may be aligned with Common Core, and at other times they may not be aligned. But I think what I'm trying to do and the story I'm trying to tell is that we've talked about standardized testing and we've talked about Common Core, and what we have is this mix that we've never seen before in our education policy world, right? Where we have states not only adopting the same set of standards when it comes to their curriculum, but also being forced to all have similar, if not identical, standardized tests. So when there's a gap in the market, what jumps in to fill it? Well, a bunch of money, excuse me, I just hit my microphone. A bunch of money jumped in. There was a huge opportunity for private industry to provide tests and resources to help states achieve those standards, not only present through No Child Left Behind, but also present through Common Core. This is what is collectively referred to as the test prep industry, or the test prep economy, right? In general, I'm going to talk about 2 to 3 major entities. We've already read Pearson. Pearson and McGraw-Hill are the major players in K through 12 standardized testing, and then the College Board is the major player in post-secondary exams. So we're going to talk a little bit about the pros and cons there. We're also going to talk about how the structures for these exams differ and how we can connect these federal and state policies to those. So, test prep companies control the content of standardized tests with little to no oversight, except for making sure that it's aligned with the standards outlined either by state curriculum or by No Child Left Behind. So, Pearson, which is to date estimated to control around 50% of the testing autonomy nationwide, is also a test book company. If you went to school, public school, after around 2001, it is almost guaranteed that at some point you took a Pearson test or learned from a Pearson textbook. This is a massive amount of influence, and stealing a little bit from John Oliver, here is the map of the power that Pearson could have over your K-12 experience. You could theoretically be at the same time learning from Pearson textbooks, taking Pearson tests, and then learning from teachers who were certified using a Pearson curriculum. Pearson is almost monopolizing the entire student learning experience, depending on what they are able to get schools and states to buy into, right? That gives them an inordinate amount of power over the student learning experience. But Pearson's power does something good for us, and it creates multiple data points by which to judge student achievement. What this does is it creates a more aggregate data set for us, which allows it to correct for some of the errors in individual tests. Racial bias is obviously a problem in tests. Confusing questions is a problem. Poor individual performances. A student shows up and has a particularly bad day and doesn't perform well on the test. But because you're taking up to 17 tests in your K-12 experience, you're able to get a more holistic view of the student's performance overall. Now, what I would argue is that aligns pretty well with how Pearson jumped into the market in the first place, right? We wanted a more holistic understanding of school performance, of teacher performance, of student achievement through No Child Left Behind and through Common Core standards. And so Pearson's ability to jump in and provide a holistic view of how students are performing over time is of benefit to policymakers. That does not mean that testing does not have its own problems, which we have talked about already, but accepting testing as part of our reality, it is very good that we have multiple data points with that control of who's creating those tests, right? But Pearson has control over all those tests, the CMAS, the CSAP, the MAP test, whatever it's called at that point. It has a lot of control over that, but there's one test that K-12 students take that it does not have control over, and it's perhaps the most important test that students take. It's called the SAT. The SAT, most of us probably took it, was created more than half a decade ago by the College Board, which is another test company, that it is the primary test point, is the primary data point by which higher education entities judge student readiness for college. There's alternatives. I didn't take the SAT, I actually took the ACT, which is almost non-existent at this point. But the SAT is basically the universal exam to assess college readiness. Because of that, instead of the multiple data points that we have with those K-12 tests, any issue with the construction or administration of the SAT has magnified consequences. So some of the readings this week are talking about racial bias in the questions, particularly when it comes to language arts. Massive implications on college accessibility for minority students. Some of the reading that I have assigned this week is a debate between Friedel, who is a prolific researcher on standardized testing and racial bias, and the College Board themselves. The College Board is responding to a 2004 piece by Friedel, which, from what I can tell, has been largely removed from most sources that haven't been locked behind a paywall. But I found a similar piece from Friedel in 2006 that kind of lays out his argument against the SAT, particularly with racial bias. But it's a really interesting conversation that they have around what role does racial bias have in testing. The SAT is also privately created and sold to districts, so that students sometimes have to pay to take the exam. Fortunately, when I took my college readiness exam, I everyone we had a federal grant that allowed every student to take it one time for free. If you messed it up and had to take it again, you're going to pay it out of pocket. But everyone got at least the data point on file. And then there's also legitimate ethical concerns over the power that the College Board has over the process. The College Board is this supposed entity that is separate from the university and higher education system that is essentially serving as the gatekeeper for college acceptance itself. A student's SAT score is the large determinant for many of these college acceptance decisions. This means that there's a vested interest in parents and students to score as well as possible on the SAT. Therefore, once again, a hole in the market happens, and we have other industry jumping in for the purpose of tutoring students to take the SAT. But as we've talked about with everything else, when we tie individual economic power to education, it exacerbates achievement gaps. The students who are able to get the additional test prep from these companies on the SAT are the students that probably didn't need it in the first place or had less of a need for it in the first place. The Bushman piece is one of my favorite pieces. It's really, really well done. It's talking about this shadow economy that was created regarding test prep and how it exacerbates that achievement gap and continues to make college inaccessible. But if we think about it, right, if we think about the system by which the College Board is filling, higher ed is an incredibly decentralized system. It has almost no universal standards. So the fact that the College Board has the ability to come in, set one data point, and have control over almost everything speaks to the decentralization of the system, because each school is making its own decision over how to determine whether or not a student is there. And if there is one data point that they can look at for every student and get a good idea of how that student's going to be ready for college, that is something that they're absolutely going to do. So I'm actually going to split up this week. Instead of doing guiding questions at the end, I'm going to stop here, provide some guiding questions for unions and test prep, and then we're going to go into accountability. So be prepared to understand and map the influence that these two different entities have over state policymaking, student achievement, and be able to connect K through 12 performance and higher education, right? Talk about the nationalization of test standards and how that impacts student performance, school accountability, student achievement. Why are teachers' unions and private industry so critical and so powerful? And how does each choose to wield its influence differently? And then finally, I'm going to underline this for no particular reason for this week, but I want you to really think on this question. Is there an inherent tension between equity and accountability in the education system? Meaning, are policies being made to promote equity that lessen accountability, and are policies being made that are increasing accountability that is inherently hurting equity? Think about that in the context of teachers' unions and these test prep companies to understand that tension. What are the equity issues that teachers' unions are attempting to address, and how does it affect accountability? And then what are the accountability issues that the test prep companies are attempting to address, and how does that affect equity? Good stuff to think about, some good guiding questions. Right now, if you do need to take a break, I know some of you have told me that you like to split up these lectures. Please go ahead and take a break while I drink this water, and you can pause it. Now we'll move on to accountability mechanisms. So this is going to be my thesis argument for the first half of this class. Now let me see if I can do the oral gymnastics to get me there. So, along with standardized testing, the other most consequential outcome from No Child Left Behind was it forced the creation of school accountability systems. And so far we've discussed how states connect student achievement to school finance and teacher pay, but we haven't really discussed what happens when schools fail to do that. So, Under No Child Left Behind, one of the things that it does is it requires that states have some sort of system in place where schools and districts demonstrate that students are making what they're calling adequate yearly progress, or AYP, towards meeting those grade level standards. So, at the beginning of second grade, a student may not be reading at a second grade level, but over time, are students in aggregate moving towards that grade level reading, right? Under No Child Left Behind, if a school fails to demonstrate AYP for 5 consecutive years, states are forced to create a system for what they're calling school restructuring. No Child Left Behind calls out 5 different options, 4.5 different options, 4 real options, and then an other category, for school restructuring that it recommends that states take a look at and implement into their system. First is chartering. Sound familiar? This is closing and reopening something as a public charter school, right? The turnaround system, so replacing school staff, including the principal, relevant to the failure in order to improve specific outcomes. I actually have a close friend of mine who worked as a turnaround officer whose job was to identify teachers who were contributing to the problem that was preventing students from meeting their adequate yearly progress marks. Contracting is another option. It's a very popular one where you contract with an outside entity to operate the school. It's essentially a private management contract. You say, well, superintendent and your administration, you don't have the power anymore. We're going to put in place a private entity that's going to manage your school for you. And then this other category where it's some form of major restructuring that makes those fundamental reforms. So, once again, this is bridging about as close to physical education policymaking as in its traditional sense as the federal government does. That being said, it is still put in this tax and spend system where you don't have to do it, but you also don't have to receive all of these federal funds, right? And so, it just like the standardized testing stuff, it creates this system that basically presents schools and states with no other option. States under this have created what are called regulatory frameworks that achieve exactly this, that restructure underperforming schools to meet the requirements of No Child Left Behind. Regulatory frameworks are exactly what it sounds like. They lay out the rules, processes, and consequences for a specific regulatory process. In this instance, it is restructuring failing schools. That is our regulatory process. So the framework is the rule book, right? Each state is determined to figure out what those rules are. I'm going to focus specifically on Colorado's Education Accountability Act in 2009. They created their framework, but I also want to present you with the opportunity to explore other states that you're interested in, whether it's Oklahoma, whether it's another state that you may have been from, that you went to school in, that you worked in. So if you're having trouble understanding that, I'm happy to sit down with you and talk through their accountability systems. I think they're really fascinating. So let's talk a little bit about Colorado's Education Accountability Act. So here's essentially the system in which Colorado put in place. Schools and districts are rated on the performance each year and assigned a particular score. Schools and districts that fail to meet a certain level, that score below a certain level, are identified as priority improvement or turnaround schools or districts. They're given essentially an asterisk in the books. What happens is that once you are given that status, you are put on a 5-year clock, just like No Child Left Behind requires, to take action to correct course, turnaround, right, and correct their performance. If a school or district is in turnaround status for 5 consecutive years, they are then called before the State Board of Education for a hearing where a panel will then conduct an investigation over the school's turnaround efforts and determine which of the restructuring options should be undertaken to correct. Which of those options outlined by No Child Left Behind would be best for this particular school or district? In Colorado, traditionally, the State Board of Education generally recommends the contracting of private management companies to correct course. I'm going to emphasize the word recommends there. In this system, it is actually, um, it is not necessarily an easy system to fall all the way through, particularly at the district level. Schools are regularly taken over by private entities, but it's generally, it can be under a chartering system or something like that. But that's generally what Colorado chooses to do. And so we come full circle. Here's the verbal gymnastics I'm going to try to point, right? Measures like this Colorado law create a set of rules that enforce a federal law. The network of everything we have discussed, teacher evaluation, standardized testing, all of these measurable outcomes are combined into one formula by which the state enforces and assesses school performance. Schools and districts must play by these rules. And what we're going to talk about in the next half of the class are how how schools and districts choose to play by those rules. Moreover, the creation and amending of these rules are subject to public comment, which means that vested interests like unions, like private industry, policy entrepreneurs, individual parents, provide input to the State Board of Education on these rules. The structure of these rules is then vital to understanding student achievement over time. Are you seeing how all of this is kind of laying on top of each other and coming together, and how this turnaround system really encapsulates everything that we've been talking about so far? And in conclusion, the federal government created this general guidance that states then created a workable policy using all of the different policy actors, ultimately with the same goal of trying to improve student achievement. Now, what happens when they don't do that? We're going to talk about Adams 14 School District. Adams 14 School District is a school district. We have what are called independent school districts in Colorado that are separate from the cities and other government entities in which they operate. Some, especially on the East Coast, larger cities, the school is actually part of another government entity, such as the city or the municipality or the county, right? Adams 14 is located within the city of Commerce City, which, if you've been paying attention, is actually the city for which I work. So I've got to see some of this firsthand. Adams 14 is entirely within Commerce City's boundaries, I think 97% within boundaries, but every student goes to school in Commerce City. Today, it serves around 6,000 students yearly, and has one of the highest concentrations of primary Spanish-speaking students in the state. Almost 63% of every student in Adams 14 speaks Spanish at home. That is an incredibly high number, especially in the state of Colorado. Moreover, more than 3/4 of all of these students, 77.2%, are on free and reduced lunch. This is the general measure by which we can see in general the socioeconomic status of the families within the community. Adams 14 has 13 schools. I think it was at one point supposed to be 14. I think that's part of the number, right? Within its district, and one high school, which is a historic high school within the community. It's called Adams City High School, which has been around longer than the district. So why are we talking about Adams 14? Is it just because it is the district that I have got to see the functioning of pretty up close by working in Commerce City? Partly. But partly because it is a very unique and consequential example of a district going through this turnaround process. So, Colorado Education Accountability Act was passed in 2009, implemented in 2010, and almost immediately Adams 14 was placed in turnaround status. It's sometimes called, I think now it's called the state watch list instead of that accountability clock, that 5-year clock, but 2010 immediately put on that clock. 5 years passed. The district was ordered to present a full turnaround plan to the state board in 2015. This was a unique circumstance because the State Board of Education was still trying to figure out exactly what its authority was going to be. So, even though No Child Left Behind was intended that at this 2015 point, after 5 years, they should have been forced to restructure in some way, instead, the district was allowed to present its own plan to turn themselves around and restructure themselves, and they justified it under that other category, right, where the state board believed that their plan was going to sufficiently turn them around. Well, 3 years come around and it still wasn't meeting expectation. It was the first district that the State Board of Education forced restructuring under. It required Adams 14 to relinquish control to a private management company. Now, schools had undergone this before. Individual failing schools had undergone this before, but never had a district undergone that before. And I think to this date, I don't think a district has undergone it still. So why did the State Board of Education think it had to take such drastic action? Well, there was a lot of testimony by people like Jose Guardiola, who is a future Commerce City council member, that said that this school district was not just failing to meet standards, it was fundamentally failing the students and the community. This was the popular sentiment. And frankly, Guardiola was not exaggerating. 80% of students in Adams 14 in 2018 were failing to meet any grade level standards in reading, language arts, or math. Wow. That's awful, right? And because of this, an unheard of 30% of students left the district, which was a result of the Colorado Public Schools of Choice law, which allows parents the opportunity to opt students in and out of districts even though they may not be zoned within that school district. Remember, coming full circle, right? So they bled 30%. In 2018, they were serving 7,500 students. They bled 30% of that student base and dropped a little over 6,000. And to this day, that's right around where they're sitting. So now, 2018 rolls around. Adams 14, upset that they're now losing control, has to relinquish all control to a private company. The company they entered into a contract with was MGT Consulting, which was a nationally recognized private management firm for schools. Under this contract, MGT controlled every day-to-day operation of the district, and its goals were to focus primarily on graduation rates and to support multilingual learners. From 2019 to 2020, for the most part, the results were not super drastic, but they were positive. They were making progress, especially in terms of their two goals that they laid out. And they also helped stem that loss, right? They weren't necessarily gaining new students back, but they were no longer bleeding students like they were before. But when it rains, it pours, and Adams 14 School Board began to look into the books and look into their budget and wonder about violations of their management contract. MGT had entered into this massive 3-year contract with the district that laid out specific terms, costs, what they were going to be doing, what they were paying for. The district started looking into those numbers and noticed some discrepancies. So in mid-2021, the school board voted very controversially to terminate the contract with MGT. This vote was not taken lightly because MGT, while minimal, was making positive results. And it would not look very good for the school board to go back before the State Board of Education, having prevented those further positive outcomes. Well, MGT obviously said you can't just close this contract. They remained in control until February of this year. But in this period, weird things started happening. The district hired a superintendent. Keep in mind, at this point, they didn't need a chief executive officer because MGT was doing that for them. But they hired a superintendent, Dr. Carla Loria, who would take over control if MGT's contract ended. They immediately commissioned a forensic audit, which is an investigative audit, of investigative look into budgets of MGT spending, and later discovered that MGT was essentially stealing around $500,000 from the district in services that they were saying were going above and beyond what their contract had laid out, when in all actuality they were definitely included within the contract. So, February 2022, MGT's contract officially ends. Adams 14 obviously called back before the State Board of Education. They gave Adams 14 one last opportunity to present a final turnaround plan that was going to accomplish what they needed to accomplish. Essentially, the State Board was sympathetic to the situation that MGT put Adams 14 in, but said, we are beyond our limits with your continued failure to educate your students. They laid out the guardrails of, if you present us a plan and that plan is not sufficient, we're going to do something beyond what we've done before. And concerns immediately rose of the closure of specific schools, of a complete dissolution of the district itself. And so Adams 14, with this pressure, created what was called a partial management plan, wherein Dr. Loria would remain in charge, and a private management company, the New Teacher Project, would report directly to Dr. Loria. And then in April, the SBE was hearing Adams City High School, also under its own turnaround status, was kept open, and the State Board of Education essentially gave a positive indication for Adams 14 to continue developing this plan. It was essentially a, we're not making a decision yet, but we like what we're seeing so far. And then, suddenly, May 2022, the SBE held a hearing, and the state formally stripped Adams 14 of its accreditation. In a 4-3 vote, the state voted for the first time to completely strip a district's accreditation and force the state takeover of Adams 14, a process known as reorganization. The board essentially argued that, yeah, I know we went back on our word, but what we were seeing in the plan just wasn't detailed enough for the amount of problems that Adams 14 had. There wasn't clear detail as to how they were going to achieve their goals, even though their goals were probably on the right track, such as creating a specific track for multilingual learners to graduate high school on track to immediately earn an associate's degree. Definitely cool, but there was concern that this plan didn't really say how they were going to do it. Moreover, it didn't really say what exactly this private management company was going to be doing. If they're reporting directly to the superintendent, it's just like the superintendent's normal staff, right? And while it was a noble effort, and I think it was a very clever policy solution that they were attempting to come up with, the State Board of Education, under No Child Left Behind, used their authority and said, we are taking over Adams 14. We don't know what's going to happen with Adams 14 yet. I believe that there are legal questions that are being disputed in the state courts around, do they have the authority to do this? All indications seem to point towards, yeah, they have the power to do it, and they're going to do it. And so it remains to be seen exactly how and exactly what's next for Adams 14. But I truthfully believe that everything we've discussed up until this point has been pointing us towards this exact story. It incorporates most, if not all, of the major themes that we've talked about. How the fear over student performance led to the creation of national standards for testing and those state regulatory frameworks. Adams 14 is an example of how mismanagement unfairly targets low-income and minority students, right? It's that equity problem there. And finally, it brings us full circle with Abrams, right? Abrams opened, just like I did, with the Friedman and Levin debate, and all about private school management. And here we are. Guiding questions on top of that, I want you to think about Adams 14 and the context of these different concepts that we've talked about: standardized testing, school finance, parental choice, no child left behind, all of these different things. And then what is the power and influence of school accountability systems at the state level? More importantly, think about this question. Is it just a coincidence that the first district to experience forced private management at the state's behest and the state takeover has the specific demographics that Adams 14 has? This is a network of issues. Education policy is not silos. It all talks to each other. And as we go forward, it's going to keep talking to each other. We're not going to completely be able to put away No Child Left Behind. We're not going to be able to put away turnaround schools. We're not going to be able to put away teachers' unions. It's all going to play into how schools are run. So, this week, read and response on Abrams. Can't wait to hear you guys' thoughts on Abrams. I absolutely love this book. That'll be due on the 17th. Make sure you complete the readings. Like I said, it is a longer reading, or it is a longer reading list. But I do believe that the group of readings, when I'm putting together a reading list, what I'm trying to do is provide a conversation through those readings. Even if the readings aren't directly talking to each other like Friedman and Levin, I guess in this point, Friedel and the College Board, I want them to be talking to each other in some way, part of that same conversation, either reinforcing some existing beliefs with different ways or contradicting each other and making different compelling arguments, right? I want particular emphasis on the Moe reading, the Moe 2009 and the Buckman reading. And then Steele, it's a super short reading, as is the accreditation fact sheet, but both fun readings, both interesting readings about this turnaround process and the state takeover of schools. Also, we're here. Exam week coming up next week. I have posted the midterm prep guide under a new midterm module. Exam prompts are going to be released on the 20th, and the response to one of those prompts is going to be due on the 25th. So, at the end of this, what I want to do is I want to go through with you the midterm prep guide so that you guys are ready for that. While I pull that up, I do want to reinforce for you that we are coming up on the due date for our final project proposals. Remember, a component of that is meeting with me about your project. So be thinking about that project topic and reach out to me sooner rather than later to schedule that time. Just because I require it does not mean that I'm going to make that final week completely open to your guys' schedules. Make sure that you're reaching out and you're being professional about setting up that meeting. That is something that is going to really set you guys up for success overall. So as we see under our midterm unit down here, we have our prep guide. Let's go ahead and take a look at this prep guide and talk through it. So this is something that is not I've not done before in this online context, but I for a class like this in particular, where it's not super skills oriented, we're more content oriented and theme oriented. I like the structure of the graduate school comprehensive exam. And so what I will do is that I am going to release 2 prompts on the Monday of exam week on June 20th. You will then choose one of those prompts to respond to and provide a written response to me by June 25th. This is a graduate level reflection of your understanding and your engagement with that prompt. It should be professionally constructed. It should include full in-text citations and a bibliography. and should be proofread for grammar, flow, and word choice. Unlike our reading responses, the exam is not to be written in casual voice. This should be a deliverable that you could provide in an academic or professional context in response to this prompt. Here's the weird part. Hear me out. Please make sure you ask questions if you have them. There is no suggested length of how long your response needs to be. And it's not even like the reading response where I'll give you like a range. I don't want to do that because I think that the prompts that I'm developing could be answered in 6 paragraphs or 60 paragraphs. And I want you guys to have your own flexibility to structure it the way you need to. But there is a cap on your response. Instead of a page limit, I am putting a time limit on it. So here's what I want you to do. Review the prompts, pick the prompt that you feel like you could best respond to, dedicate 2 hours of as distraction-free an environment as you can possibly do. Sit down and write your response. This is a trust exercise. I do expect you guys to adhere to that 2-hour limit. I will be able to tell if you spent 8 hours responding to something. I expect you to prepare something within 2 hours. That being said, it is more important that the response is a complete and revised reflection of the student's understanding and argument. The 2-hour limit is designed to limit the length of your response, not the quality. So here's what I want you guys to think about as you're going and preparing for this exam. How long do you need to respond to that prompt? What is the most structured way that I can respond to that prompt completely? And how much time do I need to revise it? Now, if you write for 2 straight hours and spend another 45 minutes revising, I don't particularly care that. It's not adding to the length, right? Remember, designed to limit the length, not the quality. So, use your best judgment. This is where I am asking you as graduate students to use your judgment, be fair, and provide a good response to these prompts. Every single one of you, I don't have a doubt, will be able to write an excellent response to at least one of these prompts. It's just a matter of now using your time, using the feedback that I provided on your reading responses, and using your understanding of the readings, of our concepts, of my lectures to give me a badass response. These will be submitted through text files. There will be no extensions. The due date is final. I will adhere to that. They're worth 15% of your total course grade, and these are not subject to the grade appeal process. I will happily talk to you about why you got the grade you got, but I will not be adjusting grades once that decision has been made. Particularly because this is your opportunity, and I've given you a lot of structure and a lot of guidance here over what this should look like. Now you've just got to go out and prove to me that you can answer one of these prompts, right? Just as a little hint for the people who have waited this long into the lecture, the prompts are going to be, I'm not going to give you 2 of the same type of prompt. One of the prompts is going to be very thematic and probably at that higher theoretical level. And then the other is going to be more applicable, more tracking the readings, the research, that sort of stuff. So I want to give you guys the flexibility to pick the one you can best respond to. And that's generally how I'm going to structure this. I have included a rubric here based off of the feedback that many of you provided me on the reading response rubric, which I really appreciate. I have done something more comprehensive here, including a complete response to the prompt, understanding and use of the readings, comprehension and use of course themes, argument and purpose, grammar and flow, and proper citations. Here's the thing with citations. You either use them or you don't. You either do the in-text and the bibliography or you don't. If you do not use a bibliography or a works cited, I do reserve the right to lower your grade further than just the points on the rubric. Cite your sources. Internal sources, super easy to cite. If you need help with any of the particular citations, reach out, let me know. External, even more important, you need to have a link to that resource as part of your citation so that I can verify the validity of your resource if you choose to use external resources. I want to be clear, you can get a 100% on this exam without using external resources, but if you choose to use them, you must cite them fully with a link so that I can verify the quality of the research. So here's what I provided at the end, and this is, I'm going to leave you guys to do this on your own, but I've essentially provided a list of themes, concepts, questions to guide your study, to really get you going. I will craft the two prompts based off of these themes. It won't incorporate all of them, obviously, but what I love about this structure of exam is that if you're really engaged with the way that I've been telling this story and the way that we've been discussing our journey through education policy thus far, you should probably have a good guess as to at least like the general idea of what the prompts are going to be. I'm not going to pull something and make you write a 2-hour response on a concept we barely talked about. Some of the concepts I include because they're important, but they're not necessarily central to what I'm trying to achieve pedagogically. I have also included a note from you, or from myself directly to you, just reinforcing, use the time limit, make sure it's revised. If anyone has any concerns about the exam, has any additional questions, please reach out. If you have a question, it is likely that someone else has that same question, and so I want to make sure that those questions are being answered. So that will be it for this week. I want to thank you guys for your hard work thus far. I want to compliment you on the quality of reading and writing that I've seen so far. You guys are incredibly insightful. I'm learning so much from each and every one of you, and I really can't wait to get more down and dirty with administration, which is, I think, more of my passion than the policy level, and these final projects, because I think you guys all have your individual perspectives that are going to be really cool for us to talk about going forward. Have a good rest of your week. Good luck on the midterms next week, and please reach out if you have any questions.